Okay, we are live.
We are.
Welcome to the show. This is the Mentionables Live. We're doing another live recording tonight. Tonight, you are welcome to join us for Mentionables Apologetic Theater 3000. So, we did our introductory episode in this kind of series last week with the movie Arrival, a fantastic science fiction flick from back in 2008, I believe it was. So be sure to go back.
We're keeping the theme of first contact movies going with another movie about first contact with an alien.
That's true. So tonight we will be doing the movie Paul, not the film about Paul, the Apostle of Christ. This one's a very different one.
Is there one?
There is one that is just Paul, I believe. I saw bits and pieces of it. I think it was actually pretty decent as far as those type
Bible
of movies go. Right. You know, any of the ones that just go straight from the text and kind of follow from there are okay. You know, subpar acting sometimes, but you know, other than that, you know, at least they're not taking
Christians.
Too much liberty.
Take what we can get.
Exactly. So, yeah, this is a very different Paul. Not at all the Paul that...
extremely different.
Yeah, that you would think it is. So...
Although there were messianic moments with this particular Paul.
Yes, you could definitely say that.
Yeah.
So before we dive in, just a reminder to listeners, please interact in the chat. Feel free to shoot questions, thoughts. If you've seen this movie, we would love to have you interact with us some on it. Let us know what you think. You know, discuss the various parts of the movie as we go through with us. And then also, be sure while you're here, if you like this kind of content, to go ahead and hit the subscribe button and notification bell. So that way we know you liked what you saw, and you can get notified next time we go live like this.
All right.
So this was your choice of a movie, Joel. So go ahead and give us a little introduction to this.
All right. So Paul is a comedy vehicle for Nick Frost and
Simon Pegg.
Simon Pegg. So these are the I think their most famous contribution was Shaun of the Dead. They also did Hot Fuzz, and this was another comedy vehicle for them that didn't do as well as those other ones for whatever reason.
I wonder why.
So Caleb, give us a hot take on this movie.
Yeah.
I'd seen it before. You hadn't.
No, I had started this movie previously because I like Simon Pegg's movies in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I remembered why I only made it about 15 minutes into this movie. My hot take would be, this is not a very hot flick. It wasn't very funny, and it just fell flat for me. It's an hour and 40 minutes I'm not getting back.
It's kind of like if Seth MacFarlane had directed E.T.
Yeah, that's a good explanation there.
Yeah. So I'll say this up front. This is not a movie I would recommend for a Christian audience. It's it's got some crude humor. It's got some foul language, some very creative foul language, in fact.
Yeah, they definitely get creative.
But nonetheless, so, depending on your sense of humor, it's probably not as funny as some Simon Pegg movies. So there's a lot of reason to not see this movie. Caleb, can you decide why I chose this movie for an apologetic take, though?
Yeah, so partway through, we get to a very interesting subplot in the film that involves deconversion. And given that, this subplot carries through the rest of the film, and it follows the deconversion of an individual along the way.
Gee, I wonder why I chose that.
I know, right? You don't have an attachment to the deconversion topic, do you? No research or anything. A little bit.
Yeah, yeah. But at any rate, so I mean, the movie starts out, in a way that appeals to a nerd like me because it starts out at Comic-Con. And it probably has some of its funniest moments at the Comic-Con there, at least for a person like myself who's actually attended a Comic-Con. So, initially I was attracted to this movie as I began watching it because it was kind of something I could relate to. Simon Pegg and Nick Frost are friends from England who decided to come to America and attend a Comic-Con, and they're also kind of UFO nerds. So while they're there, they decide to hit the hot spots in Nevada, dealing with aliens, so Area 51 and the like. And then they meet their very own alien, who's been on Earth for quite a while. He crash landed on Earth and then was taken off by the government, like you do. And then he escaped, and now these couple of nerds are trying to get him to, to freedom. And there's some very ET-esque moments in there, and they even directly reference ET, although not by name, in the movie. It's funny to me because they had, one of them said, "I've dreamed of this moment ever since I saw Mac and Me." Have you ever seen Mac and Me?
Yeah, I've had conversations with a good friend over that movie. That movie is horrendous in all the right ways. Like, if you enjoy bad movies, like, that's top of the list in terms of just awful, horrendous movies that are just hilarious to watch.
So bad they're good, right?
So bad they're good. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, Mac and Me was a very, very clear ripoff of E.T. I mean, they were riding the E.T. craze at the time, and so they came out with a movie not terribly long after E.T. that kind of rips off that plot line, more or less. And so it's funny to me that they chose that movie instead of E.T. because they never reference E.T. by name. They just make allusions to it otherwise.
Right. References to Spielberg, references to, magic finger powers, all that.
Right. And the alien in this one does some ET-esque things, and then claims credit for Spielberg's decisions in terms of ET. So anyway,
and
so that
listeners who are paying very close attention, you will find that if you go back and watch our episode on Arrival, we also reference ET there. So that's the common thread running through these episodes right now.
Yeah. So I selected this movie partially because I enjoy torturing Caleb, and partially because, it has some themes that can be addressed apologetically, unlike the previous movie, which had a lot of deep symbolism and meaning to it that could really be delved into on a philosophical level. There's nothing like that in this movie, but there are arguments that could be taken as against apologetics or against Christianity.
And I'll be honest with you. The moment I realized I was taken kind of out of this movie was actually the first moment that the creature alien speaks, and I hear Seth Rogen's voice. Like, as soon as that happened, it was like, okay, like that took me out of it entirely. But just to give a little background too, Seth Rogen is a very seemingly outspoken atheist in many ways. I don't think he came up in your deconversion research as far as I know, but from my experience,
was he previously Christian?
I don't know about that, but I can tell you that I know currently he's very much an outspoken atheist. Another movie that we'll never bring up on this show is the film he directed, Sausage Party, the animated film.
Yeah.
Nope. We couldn't even show a 30-second clip of it on here. Yeah. And it's very much a proselytizing for atheism. Like the entire message of that movie is to set up a comedic argument against Christianity.
Yeah. And I mean, a very similar film in terms of that feature would be the I'm forgetting the exact name of the movie, but it has something to do with like the birth or the creation of lying. And this one features another very famous atheist
Andy
actor
Gervais.
from England. Yeah, Ricky Gervais.
Ricky, that's it.
Yeah, Ricky Gervais. And the entire movie is, again, it's sort of a comedic argument against Christianity or religion in general. So, yeah, there's a lot of those out there, comedy movies that just sort of argue. This one definitely had that theme going through it, but it didn't exclusively spend all its time arguing that. So that was nice.
Maybe. I may have enjoyed the movie a little more had it. At least then, it would have given me something to work with because the laughs were not there.
So anyway, at some point, they've rented a camper, and they go to the Pearly Gates RV park, and which sounds cultish if I've ever heard it.
Yeah, definitely.
That might have been a direct allusion to Heaven's Gates, because Pearly
could have
Gates
been.
Yeah. So, which was a legitimate cult that actually existed in the real world, and actually had some connection to UFOs or ETs, in fact.
Yeah, Heaven's Gate was waiting on return. They thought a comet, Halley's Comet, was actually...
No, it wasn't Halley's. It was the Orbop.
Hale-Bopp, that's it.
Hale-Bopp, yeah.
Hale-Bopp.
Yeah.
So they thought Hale-Bopp's comet was actually an alien spaceship, and the only way to get beamed up was to commit suicide. So that's what they did with all their followers. It's an interesting cult because you can go and watch a lot of the videos from the teacher online. They've also...
Their website is still up.
Oh, yeah?
They've got like a flash website from like the late 90s that's...
Wow, I haven't seen that. That's cool. Yeah, so it's very interesting to be able to go and see a cult that arose very, very quickly for the most part compared to most of the cults we talk about today. And it came to quite an abrupt and tragic end.
Yeah. So there was some cult flavor to what's going on in this trailer park, but it was only just the guy and his daughter. So, I don't know if you could legitimately call that a cult and not just a really bad family relationship. But, the way he operated, the thinking and the way that they operated was somewhat cultish, in my opinion. You're the cult guy, so correct me if I'm wrong.
It's straddling that line between a cult and what you see in a lot of just extremely conservative churches. And, I don't want to use conservative in kind of a bad way. I don't think conservative's a bad word, but I think, maybe fundamentalist is the better word.
You want me to give you the technical term that I've created for that?
Yeah. Give me the technical term.
All right. The technical term, and this is, again, my term that I created in my research, because the word fundamentalist really it's not very helpful.
Right.
Fundamentalism is where you see it. So the technical term that I created is modal typical. So there's typical features that are modes of operation within these churches, and these churches are on a spectrum where you have the extreme cultish, sort of the Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate type cults on the one end, and more of an Orthodox church on the far other end of the spectrum. So,
Okay. Modal, typical. I can get behind that.
Good. Because I kind of made it up on the spot. So, all right.
Well,
So yeah,
hey,
you've got
it needs some distinction, because I would consider myself a fundamentalist in the looseness of that term, but I don't think it's sufficient for explaining exactly what I believe and how I came to those things.
And it's a
So
term that's been hijacked by the culture as well
exactly,
to
it has.
describe a specific thing. So, I mean, the problem with fundamentalist is that, you know, at root, it just means relying on on the fundamentals. So you
Right.
could use it to refer to just, you know, the bare minimum, a sort of a mere Christianity type thing, the bare bones of what we need to believe in order to be fundamental in our belief. So, you know, I mean, that's legitimate. That's nice. There is a fundamentalist theology, which is a very specific movement that occurred, and they have, you know, they have books and so forth that are laying out exactly what that movement did. So that's another wrinkle. And then there's, of course, the way in which the culture uses fundamentalist, which essentially is dogmatic. You know, you're a dogmatist. You kind of stick by your guns on these sort of extreme ideas, and that sort of shapes your worldview. Now, I
Right, and
recently,
it's tied beyond religion too. And it's not just, you know, the Christian worldview, but the fundamentalist title is very
yeah,
much tied in with political movements at this point as
right,
well.
exactly. And Tyler Vela, our other mentionable,
Who's that?
likes look him up in our other videos.
Okay.
Anyway, he's one of the mentionables, but he tends to refer to fundamentalist atheists, which are, again, these sort of dogmatic atheists that aren't willing to entertain any ideas beyond the extremes that they hold to. And typically, you know, these are people who come from fundamentalist churches and they've deconverted, and then they kind of maintain those sort of ideologies and modes of thinking in their atheism. Now, I was reading a paper recently. It was an academic paper about deconversion, and this one was arguing that deconversion comes typically from fundamentalist churches, and they opened up a idea about what fundamentalist is that really clarified a lot of things for me. So they talked about fundamentalism, this sort of fundamentalist mindset, as sort of the far side. Okay, if you had a spectrum wherein complete certainty was on one side of the spectrum and nihilism was on the other, fundamentalism would be complete certainty. So you have this idea where you know the truth, you know the absolute truth, and you're in no way unsure that what you have is absolute certainty. And then if you were to step even a little bit beyond absolute certainty, you're taking a step into the void of uncertainty. Um, so, you know, and that was very interesting because that kind of cleared something up that I've been struggling with in my research, is this idea of, you know, that sort of there's this complaint that you have complete certainty in the churches, and you know that cleared it up on exactly what that was. But we stray from the contents.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, so they go into this trailer park, the Pearly Gates trailer park, and they meet somebody new.
Yeah.
And this becomes sort of the focus of our discussion.
Yeah, so we're actually going to share a scene from this here. I will give people a warning, given the nature of this movie, there is possibility of some foul language here. I'm going to try and keep it out of what we show. But the warning's out there. If you're watching this with your kids, I don't know why you'd do that anyway. Or if my kids are watching this, they should probably turn it off now. You've been warned. All right.
It's Ruth.
Oh, don't you dare open that door.
Hi. Morning. May I come in?
No, come on in. No, I think you should come in. It's not really dressed. Come.
Was everything okay?
Yes, it was. It
Yes,
was very nice.
thank
Very
you.
nice.
It was
The best, I think.
adequate.
So where's the other one?
The other one, just
Oh, it's okay. We don't charge by the person. There were 3 shadows I saw dancing around the RV last night, right?
the other one. The other one. No,
I'm in the can. I ate a closed pistachio. I'm paying for it.
It's a nice T-shirt.
Oh, thanks. I got it at my church. It's Jesus shooting Charles Darwin
Why would Jesus want to shoot Charles Darwin?
because of his blasphemous theories. Are you men of God?
We're men of science. You know, we believe in the establishment of a biological order through the maelstrom of physical and chemical chaos.
God created the earth in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested.
Really?
Or it could be God. You don't know, do you? It's up in the air.
The world is 4,000 years old and can only be the product of intelligent design.
Oh, that's
All right, we got it.
Next to
just
the
in
trigger
time.
figure, man.
Yeah, I know. It was close.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there, I think.
Yeah, and of course that scene is immediately followed by at least one explicitive, just to give you an idea.
Yeah, so in that particular scene, she's really conservative in her numbers. 4,000 years old.
Yeah, I mean, even for most young Earth creationists, that's like really, really pushing it.
Yeah, no, 6,000 years old is the classic number, and I've heard it stretched as far as 10,000.
Hmm.
Again, on the Mentionables seem pretty fluid on their take in terms of creation and evolution. Again, I've explained a number of times I'm completely and agnostic on the issue, and intentionally so. But I mean, we covered the gambit there, but obviously this is very important to this character, and it's important to this character because the writers made it important to this character.
Right.
She turns out to be sort of a caricature of what the writers think Christians tend to be. So yeah, I mean, there's this sort of antagonism towards evolutionism that she introduces there. And she ended her little spiel with intelligent design. And that's interesting because in academic circles, they very much try to, separate intelligent design from creationism. And I think this is on the writer's part where, on the other end of the scientific spectrum, they just entangle creationism and intelligent design and assume the two things basically are the same. You want to explain the difference between creationism and intelligent design?
Yeah. So, and again, these are terms that a lot like fundamentalism are very intertwined. So in general, creationism would refer to any special creation via God in a general sense. However, it's taken more of a leaning towards what Christians would distinguish in general as young earth creationism or old earth creationism. So views that the beginnings of life on this planet were a direct act. Now, that direct act itself is the intelligent design. So intelligent design can also take on different meanings, but in general, the most common distinguishing kind of factor of this is, as opposed to the theory of abiogenesis within the subheading of evolution, you're dealing with intelligent design. So creation, animals, humans have a specific design by a creator. Some would take that so far as to say that design is somewhat evolutionary. Some would say it's non-evolutionary entirely. But in general, these terms have a wide berth of meaning compared to kind of their general use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a little later in that same scene, she alludes to the irreducible complexity, which is one of the arguments that intelligent design uses, like Michael Behe.
Yeah, Michael Behe.
Right. He wrote Darwin's Black Box, I believe, and he makes the argument. Specifically, he uses the flagellum on a bacteria, and how there's actual gears, atomic gears built into it to move the flagellum, and there's no way of saying how that could possibly have come about. Piece by piece to come together. And, and there's arguments against that. I'm not a person educated enough in the field to make those arguments for or against.
Right. And I think this will become important more later in the movie, but the typical one used very, very often by young earth creationists. It's gained a lot of ground, in the prior in the 90s was the irreducible complexity of the eye. And I think that's actually the one they mention here in this movie.
That's the first one she brings out.
Right. The argument for the flagellum is much stronger, I think, in terms of looking at that from a biological standpoint. We're not going to go into that all here. But, the eye is the one that's been the case heard by Christians for years and years and years, is that, the eye is not something that could have developed piece by piece by piece. And, Richard Dawkins, for one, spends a lot of time trying to give a good rebuttal to this idea. And I don't find it that compelling that the eye is irreducibly complex. There's certainly some argument to be had, but there's good reason to think that maybe it's not.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the information and evolutionary arguments that your average churchgoer will hear will be from like Answers in Genesis or these creationist, sites and conferences and so forth. So, in my studies of deconversion, what I often see is that they'll go off to college and then they'll hear about evolution from an evolutionist, and they'll realize that everything they've always heard was straw man. And that, when you steel man evolution, it begins to become a lot more convincing. And, this is one of the things that I've seen lead to deconversion in some of these cases. It's not insignificant in terms of this sort of church versus university battle that you see. And of course, go ahead.
And I'll say one great thing to do from a average kind of Christian apologist perspective within the church is whenever I do an apologetic style class, I'll often do an atheist role play with people. And this will not be quite what you think it will be. I will come in and I will not straw man anything. If somebody throws irreducible complexity out of the eye, I know the argument well enough that I can rebut it there with the Christians in the room so that they'll see, okay, the typical kind of things I'm using are not strong enough for somebody who knows this stuff or who has looked at it at all. So it encourages people to, dig deeper, know the arguments of the other side. It's not something to be afraid of versus kind of what we're seeing in this scene where it's, the shirt with Jesus shooting Charles Darwin that she got from her church. Like it's hollow and
it's like the ichthus eating the Darwin symbol that people put in the back,
right?
Kind of thing. That this antipathy is fostered on the Christian side between the university and the church in terms of evolution.
And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me to go out to a church in my area and see them handing out shirts like that.
Yeah. So shortly,
actually, before we go any further, just to when I first watched this movie, it seemed somewhat a caricature of what we see. But there's a major young earth creationism ministry this week that's come out with statements about well, if we're canceling everything, we should cancel evolution and Charles Darwin. They've literally made statements this week that since we're in a cancel culture, let's cancel Charles Darwin entirely and just trash this from history and science. Let's get it gone. And they've made the remarks kind of off the cuff, but I mean, it's no different than what we're seeing in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, I've briefly referenced earlier that, I'm agnostic in terms of origins. And the reason I choose to be that is that I am not sufficiently educated on either side, on the arguments of either side, in order to defend a side. And this, as an intentional choice that I've made as an apologist, is that I do not defend a position that I have not yet studied sufficiently to defend that position. There are arguments on the creationist side. I've heard them. I don't know the rebuttals to those, and this caricature of creationists that you see, especially as you enter the apologetics world and actually interact with atheists, and not the caricature of atheists that you get on the creationist side. You see that the creationist arguments seem pretty flimsy when looked at from the eyes of an evolutionist. But again, I don't know enough about evolution to address those either. So, I have made the decision that I do not take stands on issues that I cannot defend.
And this was one of those issues for me that had a big role in kind of my struggles with faith at one point. Is age of the earth and whether or not evolution were true was an important factor in whether or not I put belief and kept belief in Christianity. And so it was something I did dive in and do a good bit of study on. But what I was very quick to find out in a very short period of study was that, you know what? There are some arguments for young earth creationism. There are some good arguments for old earth creationism. There are some good arguments for
progressive creationism.
Progressive creationism or theistic evolution. If you noticed, I didn't throw good arguments there for young earth creationism. And I'll leave that as a jab at any of the other mentionables who may disagree there. But, and there's also some good arguments for a non-literal interpretation of the text. They generally go with progressive creationism, but there are good reasons that we shouldn't interpret Genesis in a scientific manner. And I stand by a lot of those currently. I think they're probably the most consistent. And again, like you, I'm kind of agnostic on the issue. I don't see that I'm going to be presented with evidence to pull me back to the younger side at this point, but I'm not excluding it either.
Yeah.
For me, this is a matter that it's like, I can struggle with this internally. It's something I can study for my own interest. But when speaking with somebody who's an atheist or agnostic or skeptic in general, these are not issues that I foresee as needing to come to the table, because I would rather convince them of theistic evolution and have a conversation about Christ, or old earth creationism and have a conversation about Christ sooner than I would to sit down and have a battle over how old the earth is and never get to the point of the conversation, the salvation they can receive in Christ through his death, burial, and resurrection. If I can get to that point sooner by setting these issues aside, sure, that may be something they struggle with looking at the evidence for their whole life. I'm okay with that, because it's not an issue that impacts salvation. And that's what I'm concerned about is, are they on the right side of that conversation? Not are they on the best possible side of a creationism argument?
Yeah. So, I mean, any argument made on the atheist side that ends with, and therefore God does not exist, I've never heard one single argument made wherein that conclusion wasn't a leap. At best,
Right.
It might be an abductive case against the existence of God, but I don't think any one argument on the atheist side can reasonably come to that conclusion. I'll allow that, enough arguments piled on top of each other can eventually make a good case against the existence of God. But just positing evolution over creationism doesn't do it.
No,
So-
because it's not critical to Christianity, and there's plenty of Christians who don't believe in creationism in the sense that it's portrayed, such as in this movie. It's portrayed as only being young earth creationism.
Yeah.
Intelligent design is conflated with not only creationism, but young earth creationism. And in this case, at 4,000 years, a hyper young earth creationism. So,
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, even this movie is making a straw man out of creationists because there are arguments, whether or not I think they're good arguments, but the kinds of things she said are not those arguments.
no.
The closest she got to an argument was the irreducible complexity of the eye. And that one was just shot down immediately. So then Paul,
and
the
you know,
alien,
they even caricaturize that in the film in a way that is a subtle joke for those who have had these conversations, in that she has one eye that has a defect in the retina. So, they're even characterizing it in that way.
Yeah. Which, I mean, I got to give them credit for putting that kind of subtlety in the movie because they don't make it super obvious. But then Paul the alien comes out and he does some messianic things. He heals the blind, he heals her eye. And, shortly thereafter, this might be before they met her, but, he brings a bird back to life. And I don't know if this was an intentional reference to this sort of birth or childhood narrative of Jesus where he, breathes life into clay birds. Probably not. I doubt they're that sophisticated in the movie. That was probably just coincidental. But
probably
one of the things that happens whenever he heals, which happens, I think, a total of 3 times in the movie, is that he takes the damage upon himself, which sort of has a messianic feel to it as well. So he heals the blind. He resurrects a bird that died. And then near the end of the film, he does his most messianic thing where he resurrects a man that just got shot and is dead. So he brings the dead back to life, and he takes the bullet wound upon himself so that he dies, and then he resurrects. And, when all of those things happen and they ask him how he did those things, at one point, even her religious father says that it was a miracle that he worked. And he turns and says, no, it was evolution. So again, that's sort of that jab against the idea that things can happen by magical properties rather than just natural properties. So after she sees this alien and she has after this argument in the bathroom about creationism, he comes out, she sees the alien, and then he does, obviously this becomes the second argument against Christianity, the first being being evolution. The second is the fact that there is in fact an alien whom she calls a demon originally, in order to explain away how there could be an alien life form. And then he does sort of a mind meld on her where he transfers all of his vast knowledge into her. And after seeing his knowledge, she realizes that everything she's ever believed is a lie. And that's when she deconverts. And I'd like to talk about that in a minute. But I'd like to first address the 3 arguments that are brought. And I think those are the only 3 arguments in the film. The first being evolution, which we've addressed. The second being alien life. Now, we've discussed this on an earlier podcast several years ago, but this is an argument that happens every once in a while, that if there are alien life forms, then God does not exist. It's just this leap from aliens, therefore no God. Do
Right,
you
and
get how
this
that?
movie makes it very clear that
Yeah,
that is the argument for this film anyway, and that boom, aliens, therefore no God.
yeah. Do you get how that argument works?
I've thought through this a number of times, and I think it probably largely stems from people like Dawkins, who proponent that the best explanation they can come up with for life on this planet is that it was seeded here somehow by an either intelligent or non-intelligent other species of some kind from somewhere else out in the universe that either had more time to evolve, or meteor with some organic life crashed into the planet, because most of the theories for abiogenesis just don't hold up very well, especially when you look at the statistics and the probability of that happening with those very early cells. That there aren't good experiments to show us that this can actually happen. So with that being said, I think that the reason this is held to so tightly is people think that, okay, if we find there's somebody else out there in the universe, then surely that's how life got here on this planet. And I think it's leading to a stronger version of that argument versus therefore there's no God. Now, there's some more I'll go into, but I think that answers at least the question as to where it kind of came from.
Well, you said there's more to go into. I'd like to give my take on the argument, but before I do, did you want to finish up your thought?
Well, I was just going to go into a Christian explanation on the other side. So, I'd like to hear your take before we go down that road of kind of the answer to this issue, if you will.
All right. So the Christian kind of take on the sort of broader schema, the meta-narrative of Scripture, is that God creates the universe, and then he has a special creation in man and woman, in which he creates them in his image. And they kick off this sort of human race. And then there's the sin and the fall affects the entire universe. So that all of creation groans, etc., because of the sin of human beings. And thereafter, there's this sort of long narrative which results in God becoming man, becoming a human being, this sort of special creation of God. And he, becomes human. He dies, he resurrects, and he ascends to heaven, where he sits on the right hand of God as a human being, as a particular species of life. And then, eventually there's the new heavens and the new earth, etc. And so this is a very human-centric sort of narrative. And so the struggle is, if we find intelligent life which is equal to us in all other aspects in terms of moral agency and reason, and essentially they're different looking versions of us. They have all of the same aspects of human beings in the ways that count, in their ability to reason and use logic and create technology and exercise moral thinking. And so at that point, humanity loses its special status. And it also demonstrates that evolution does in fact work, because there is the creation of these not the creation, but the evolution of other life forms on other planets, showing that evolution is a successful form. So that you've got that, reduction of the specialness of human beings in the universe, and then you've got the argument for evolution. And then, of course, there's the C.S. Lewis kind of question of, well, would God have to incarnate on every planet as every different life form and do his sort of redemptive act over again, because they're not human, they're a different life form type thing. So, the argument essentially evolves around, or revolves around, this idea that on the Christian narrative, humans are a special creation, and they're made in the image of God. And, once they lose their specialness, that narrative kind of plummets. So do you get that argument?
Yeah, that's more sophisticated than what I usually hear, though. But
All right.
I get it. And I think there are a couple reasonable explanations. I don't think anyone is going to satisfy someone who's holding to this to the extent that, this is where they're kind of grounding things. They're going to find ways around it. But I think that particularly there's a couple problems with that argument in that,
Okay.
one, you have the question of the image of God. So either these species are made in an image of God somehow, and they have the redemptive act paid for by Jesus in the form here or some other form. To speculate that far out is to really speculate beyond the knowledge we have right now. Is it a question that may come up? Sure. But it's certainly so much speculation. It's hard to even go into because we don't know what the situation would be if we found life on another planet. In most situations, that's probably going to be, unintelligent life versus intelligent life. Even from an evolutionary perspective, if you consider that, then in most of the scenarios where we're going to discover life, it's probably unlikely that it developed to the point of being intelligent life. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
I would think that if we were to find life on another planet, an alien creature which looks different than us, and yet it communicated in the way we do, it reasoned in the way we do, and it perceived morality in the way we do, that would be evidence for God, because it follows this sort of universality of reason and morality, in which which are grounded in the sort of ontological, abstract, above just material universe. I would say that, if you were going to use them as evidence against God, it would have to be in a way that they operated completely different from us. They were sophisticated in some way, similar to us. Well, sophisticated, yeah, but they didn't think like us. They didn't operate like us. They didn't have the same morality. That would be more convincing to me than if we went and they thought, they were other versions of us. Because, that would seem, well, that's evidence for a commonality of not biology, but rather logic, morality, reason, those things which we say are grounded in God's nature.
Right. No, absolutely. And then, we would have no reason in that scenario to doubt that, Jesus's sacrifice here wasn't part of the grand plan for them to reach out to us or, make communication in that way so that they can receive that salvation as well, especially if they have that imago Dei, the image of God that we do, because we don't believe that's, just being a person. It is something deeper than that. So
I don't find that to be a particular challenge, because the Christian doctrine allows for intelligent moral agents that exist in the universe besides human beings,
right,
and aren't part of that specific redemptive story. They have a different relationship with God. They're called angels. And other, there's allusions to other heavenly beings. But the point is that it is possible, it's already built into Christian doctrine that there are intelligent moral agents which aren't part of that particular redemptive story, and yet have a relationship with God and operate in an intelligent moral way. And so, if we were to run into aliens, there's no reason to assume that they have to play into our particular redemptive story. They could have a different relationship with God, just like all the other moral agents that exist in the universe besides humans.
Right. And, given that, and this is going to go down a road that may turn some people off, but, and they parody this in the movie by her claim that he's a demon immediately. Mm-hmm. But in terms of looking at evidence, when we sit down and look at evidence, there are a certain number of residual UFO encounters So by that, I mean, when we look at all the UFO sightings that we see, most of them can be explained by something. So there was one back from, I think, the Apollo 11 mission that just this week I read up on, and what looked like a saucer UFO was actually one of the lights from the module that had broken off. So looks like a saucer floating through the air. People have claimed it's a UFO for years. Well, guess what? We have an explanation for that now. So if we took all the scenarios that were either hoaxes, had reasonable explanations, the ones that are clearly from unreliable sources of some kind, if we took all those, threw them out, we'd still have this residual. So there are some situations that we don't have a good explanation for what these UFOs in these particular encounters are. And many of them are accompanied by what people would describe as abduction experiences. I have a hard time buying into most of them, but some of them, people have experienced something. Whether that's something that's called deep psychological trauma that they're not actually able to deal with logically, I don't know. But if we took the residual UFOs, threw them out, or keep the residual UFOs, throw out all the rest, do the same thing with alien encounters. Throw out the unreliable ones, keep the ones that we at least have reason to question them and say something weird happened here. There's a lot of commonalities there. And a lot of those commonalities point to beings that are sending a different message of salvation in some way. They discredit the Christian account so much. And interestingly enough, that seems to be the only belief they really attack. And in many of these cases, people who have called on Jesus's name have had these kind of things stop. Now, again, there are some reliable cases of this out there. I'm not saying that you should immediately buy into this, but while the movie parodies the fact that she immediately jumps up and says this alien's a demon, when you dig deeper, there's some legitimate reasons that Christians actually consider UFO and alien activity to be demonic. And one of those from a scientific perspective is that, a lot of the activity seen in these residual UFOs is stuff that can't be accredited for by physics. And not to mention the fact that, given the laws of physics, we just don't see that faster than light speed travel is really something that is easy to pull off, even if there were another intelligent life. So chances are, if there is anything that's occurring in these encounters, it's something local. And given what we know about these handful of things that are left, and by handful I mean we're still talking there's hundreds of encounters left over, but the case for alien and UFO activity being demonic in some way, shape, or form is not quite what it's portrayed at in the movie either.
I'm not a big fan of jumping to the demon explanation for things.
I'm right there with you. I think it's a possible explanation. It's not necessarily the one that I would go to right away, though. Probably the last thing I would go to on my list.
All right. Yeah, like the devil buried dinosaur fossils to
right
deceive us
exactly.
about the age of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's. I think people are a little too quick to jump to the devil and demon explanation for things, and I would avoid it unless it was unavoidable in some way. But at any rate, leaving that aside, I think that covers the arguments that they used against religion. So I'd want to jump into the deconversion experience if you're game for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what happens is that, she kind of, after he does the mind meld and transfers all of his knowledge into her, she, more or less awakes as an atheist. Um, her worldview is shattered. And, she displays that. She's very upset that, everything she's been taught is wrong. Um, and then she immediately jumps to this sort of, so I can do anything I want now, right? Which was interesting to me for two reasons. But the thing that struck me about that is, you hear the atheists say that, oh, I don't need religion to give me a standard of morality. If I were, if I were religious or an atheist, I would still maintain the same moral standards. But then, her response to that seems to kind of belie that notion that your standards would remain the same. Now, having said that, the point that they were making with this movie is that she was the standards to which she was held, and she has a relationship with her father where her father is kind of ordering her around, and she kind of is the doormat to him. She does whatever he tells her, and she's very subservient to her father, who's just kind of shouting orders at her and preaching at her, and she believes whatever he says and so forth.
Right.
So-
Most viewers would see it as very abusive.
Yeah. I didn't want to jump straight to abuse, but yeah, it definitely has that flavor to it. So at any rate, now she goes with them. She doesn't stay with her father at the campground. And so, immediately upon this, she says, well, I can do whatever I want. And so she, the obvious one is she, she decides that,
The quote is, I can drink, I can fornicate, I can curse.
Yep. So, and the cursing thing is the one that they have fun with, because for the remainder of the movie, she's attempting to curse and doing a poor job at it. She's like, farts and buttholes and, things like that.
Yeah,
so
really,
she's
really awful. Even
attempts.
Yeah, horrible attempts.
I had when I worked at the school for students that had behavioral problems, there was a kid there. I was in the middle school. He was probably 13 years old, and he was just like that. In the middle of class, he would like say things like farts, buttholes, boobies. He would just say these words that weren't really curse words, but it was like if a Christian kid had Tourette's syndrome.
Right.
Was tried to curse, but just didn't know how. But
yeah, it's like that feeling as a parent when you got to get up in the middle of the night. You deal with your kid's issue. You finally get them back to bed. You're on your way back to bed. And right there on the last step is a Lego. And your bare feet step into that Lego, and it drives so far into your skin, it's going to leave a mark. And you can just feel that. And you search for a word and don't want to wake up the house, and all of a sudden, something completely bizarre comes out of your mouth.
Yep. Excellent way to put it. So anyway, that was, the funny thing with her.
Speaking of which, to interject for just a moment, Babylon Bee has an excellent list of Christian cursing alternatives. So listeners should check that out afterward.
No doubt. But they make a good point there, because I have yet to listen to any of these deconverts, who are being interviewed or just talking in general, that are not excessively profane. You can tell they're like just searching for opportunities with any given sentence to slip the most profane words that they can think of in there. So what they display in the movie is that, it's an actual thing. when people go from being Christian to atheist, that particular censor that they keep on themselves drops, and they start cursing. And I mean, I get the feeling they do it intentionally because it's something they're free to do now. That particular barrier has dropped. There's no reason for them not to, and it's something that they've been kind of avoiding for their entire Christian life. They've been intentionally censoring their language. They don't have to, so they don't. And I mean, everything that she said there, the fornication, the cursing, the whatever the other one was, drinking or whatnot. This is exact, I mean, that displays a very keen insight into what happens when you deconvert, because no longer do you have to censor or curb your behaviors. You get to do whatever you want. So I was listening to an interview with, it was a Mormon girl who deconverted and left her husband, and she, went and immediately became a dominatrix because that was kind of the direction she wanted to go. She didn't have to do that. And frequently, I mean, you hear this, you're like, my biggest regret in life was, not dating more, getting married when I was young, that kind of thing. And so there's this real push and desire to go out and have as many sexual encounters as you possibly can. So that happened. And then, they pick up drinking habits and all of these things, everything that she was listing. This is exactly what you see in deconversions. So she did it in a comedic way. It's a comedy movie, so that's what you're going to do. But in fact, what she was displaying there was a real phenomenon you get in deconversions. And you can understand that, right? I mean, they've been censoring themselves. They've been curbing their own behaviors. They've been kind of, keeping themselves under control for so long. And now they don't have to do that anymore. So you go out and you have all these experiences you weren't allowed to have before.
Yeah. I mean, I get it. I think, that's common for a reason, because like you had mentioned earlier, a lot of these people come from modal typical kind of situations. So they're in a situation where it's more about repressing behavior than it is about the actual gift of what salvation is, which is a forgiveness of sins, but it's a gift. The response is altering behavior and trying to go closer to that person you're meant to be. But it's not a requirement, which I think many people are confused on. But then, in addition to that, coming from that kind of background where it's all about repress this, repress that, repress this, repress that, and it's constantly an effort to remove something from your life, no wonder these things are going to come flood back in. I think you probably see the same thing with a lot of progressive Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, progressive Christians, I would say,
and again,
maybe
progressive is kind of a loose term here, but
yeah, maybe a quarter of them started out in more of a fundamentalist and moved in that direction over time. And this is something that, at least in deconversion cases, I see is that they take on what I call leftward drift, wherein as this person starts to have more and more objections to Christianity, you can kind of avoid those objections by moving to the left a little, and this would be social things as well. So you start to have difficulties with the way the church approaches the treatment of women or the treatment of LGBTQ, etc. And so all you have to do is move to the left and those problems go away. And so, I mean, your progressive Christianity is probably composed of maybe a quarter of people who moved there because they didn't like the way fundamentalists were doing things. And it's a more permissive environment. So now you can curse, now you can fornicate, now you can drink, all of those things that you wanted to do before, but couldn't. Now, in my model of the modal typical church, this would be what I call performance control. And performance control is an environment where everyone within that environment polices each other in terms of, rewarding particular types of behavior with respect and with kind of this, I don't want to say worship, but definitely looking up to the individuals who live in a certain way. And then, if anybody steps out of line, there's this punishing aspect. The environment becomes kind of aversive because people withdraw from that person. They look down on that person. Suddenly the environment becomes very uncomfortable when they act in certain ways, and it becomes more comfortable. And if you are a person within that environment, you're participating in this enforcement of these behaviors on other people within that environment. And so this is one of the things that deconversion comes from, is escape behavior. The church has become an aversive environment. You desire to escape from aversion. And so atheism, or, not religion, whatever that is, becomes attractive because it allows you to escape from the aversive environment in which you are. Now, there are cases in which this environment actually is rewarding if you're the kind of person who is able to do the holier than thou thing. So there are people that are actually very comfortable and rewarded in these modal typical environments because they are able to walk the walk. And, when they behave in that way, they're rewarded in the environment. They're able to look down on other people. They have this sense of superiority or self-esteem that comes from that environment. So those are the two ways in which the environment drives behavior.
It makes sense. And I think that as much as many churches are trying to kind of lose this, certainly some of the churches I've been to have tried to kind of stray away from, what the last 10 years may have kind of brought on and really expanded this kind of modal typical church. I think despite that, there's a lot that's held on to in terms of, standards of conduct. If you think about this, to be a small group leader in a lot of churches, there's a standards of conduct you have to abide by. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a standards of conduct, but it's this expectation for you to not do X, Y, and Z. And then to be an elder within those churches, there's expectations that on top of that, you're also not to do A, B, and C. And, so even though it may not be as obvious, this is kind of a thing within the church where we're adding on to kind of what Scripture says. Scripture gives us very clear indication of what elders need to not do. There is some guidance for elders within the church and what kind of conduct they should be from. My dad was a great man, and because he had been divorced in the past, he would always decline eldership within the church. I admired him for that because the Bible made it kind of clear on that situation. And so, he always declined the eldership despite pastors saying, no, that's okay as long as your conduct reflects this now. So I think whenever we expand things and take it beyond what the Bible says, we're getting us in an interesting situation where we're moving, even if maybe not so obviously, towards exactly what you're talking about. Certain kind of behaviors are rewarded and others are punished, for no better sense of the word. It's just the way it is within a lot of churches right now.
Yeah, in the Jewish religion, they call that Talmudic, not behavior, but approach, I suppose, where you kind of expand the rules a little bit beyond the rules in order to prevent yourself from breaking the rules.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, and it's not unreasonable for a person in position of authority to be held to a standard. That is the case in any position of authority. I mean, if you're the manager of a store, then you're expected to show up on time for your shifts. You're expected to treat your employees according to a certain standard. There are expectations placed on you that are not unreasonable expectations. The question when it comes to the church environment is, when do those expectations exceed being reasonable? And this is not something that I think we can address right here and now, but yeah. So, I mean, performance control, where does the line get drawn? I mean, if you're too permissive, then the person can get away with a little too much in the church environment. If you're too restrictive, then you stray into sort of the legalism, which becomes destructive within an environment. So, but yeah, I can't solve that for you right here and now. But let's see, what was the next thing in terms of the deconversion for her? The only thing that really comes to mind was at the end of the movie, right before the alien's about to leave Earth. Spoiler alert. Don't go see this movie.
It's not worth it.
Yeah. So
we're
yeah,
giving you literally the best stuff in the movie here. You've seen it, you're hearing it. You get what you need out of it. It's not worth it.
It could have been a good movie. I liked the idea of I like the idea of a couple of nerds picking up an alien. That was funny. That's a good premise to a movie. There was action in it. That was good. Action, comedy, intrigue, and like the reference to nerdy stuff. I'm kind of a nerd. So
the thing I give them credit for is they had the best possible cast for this movie. They had all the right people for this movie. They had great cameos in it, but they didn't utilize it any to, really amp up the comedic value.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I liked a lot of the nerdy references in there because I'm a nerd at heart and, overtly as well. But yeah, it wasn't worth it for the other stuff that came along with it. At any rate, at the end, the alien is kind of apologizing to her for destroying her faith. And she says, "You didn't destroy it, you set me free." And this is, again, a fairly accurate portrayal of what happens in the deconversion cases, that in most cases, the person reports this feeling of, freedom or relief for finally being free of religion. And I think that this ties back into what we've already talked about, that there's this sort of restrictive sense in religious environments, and there's this performance control that we just spoke of. And once you toss all that stuff out the window, you're free to do what you like. You don't have to censor yourself. You don't have to hold yourself according to a standard. And that sort of environment wherein everybody is judging you and kind of keeping you in line with guilt and shame and those kinds of things, that's gone. You don't have to do that anymore. And so there's this sense of freedom. There was a bus campaign, I think it was in England, but I wouldn't swear to that, where the atheists bought advertisement space on a lot of buses, and the slogan that they put on it was, "There's probably no God, relax and enjoy your life." And that kind of portrays this exact thing. If there is no God, suddenly life is better because you don't have this judgmental character sitting up and kind of forcing you to live according to a standard. I think that part of this is reflective of a theology that lacks sort of the redemptive aspects to it, because it's more of this all good boys and girls go to heaven, and if you sin in any way, shape, or form, you go to hell idea. This sort of carrot and stick, which is a vast oversimplification of what Christianity actually teaches, and leaves out the redemptive aspects entirely. So,
Yeah.
And that's what I was able to pull from the film. I liked that it had some very accurate um, ways in which it portrayed the behavior that follows deconversion and the kind of things that a deconvert goes through. One of the things that they didn't have her go through was the negative aspects of deconversion. And this is not being a Christian saying that deconversion is wrong. This is me being a researcher and psychologist saying that deconversion is difficult. And it is difficult because you lose the community, the Christian community, the religious community to which you belonged. And honestly, the people who are most likely to deconvert, and by that I mean start identifying as atheists, as anti-religious, are the people who are most involved in the religious community. If you are not very involved in your religious community, it's easy enough to kind of step out the door, drift away, and not suffer any kind of major effects of that. The people who are very involved are the ones who really have these full deconversions where they end up standing against the religion, and they also have the loss of community, which was important to them. So you have that. You have an identity crisis because, again, being a Christian is sort of central to your identity, and it definitely was to hers. And so you have to define who you are now that you're not religious, now that you're not a Christian. Who exactly am I? And that identity crisis occurs. And I think you saw a little of that with her, sort of this identity crisis thing. But it was she was very happy in assuming her new identity. So there was
right.
It's not always like that. And so, yeah, that happens. Your life is sort of upturned because most of what you built your life around is now gone. And then possibly the worst part is that when you come out to your religious community, then they have to go through a reverse identity crisis. They have to deal with the fact that you are no longer one of them. You're the bad guy. You've gone over to the other side. You've joined Darth Vader and gone to the dark side. And so that's a difficulty that the religious community has to go through, and the way that they respond to you because of that. It's not as you're not just losing that community. You are assuming an antagonistic relationship with that community. And so all of those things result in what I call a deconversion crisis, which is an extremely difficult time for a deconvert to go through. And it results in a lot of negative emotions and feelings. So
I think that raises an extremely important point that we can't stress it enough in these conversations, is the fact that you presenting this research and going through all this information about deconversion and studying these cases it's not with the goal of, if we know exactly how this happens, we can prevent it from happening. I don't think that's your goal, right?
No, at this point, my goal is to find out the facts and then share that information.
Right.
Now,
and from a Christian perspective, as a Christian, as an apologist, as an evangelist, I take that and I say, okay, with this information, we know these people are going through something that's very, very difficult and hard to go through, painful. Probably very many times they may be in the throes of, when losing their community, if they suffer from depression along with that, suicide may become a viable option to people in these situations. So what we have to remember with this is that when somebody's going through this, it's not a time to bash them overhead with, Jesus shooting Darwin shirt. It's a time to come alongside people and build relationship. And we're to be salt and light. So in doing so, we have to build relationships. We have to come alongside people. And, all we can do in some of these scenarios is ask questions and talk with someone through what they're going through, but we shouldn't withdraw our friendship, even to a certain extent our community. Sure, they may not be fit for the church anymore, but why not invite them to small group? Why should you not have someone who's questioning their beliefs or even doesn't believe anymore within your small group?
So when in cases of conversion, and I study conversion about equal to the level that I study deconversion, conversion typically takes place when the individual comes in contact with a person or group within the religious community. And this becomes an impetus for becoming adopted into that community, being comfortable with that community, those kinds of things. I can think of only one case in which a person's deconversion process involved meeting a friendly atheist and kind of being influenced in some way by that atheist. So when you see a person who deconverts start to sort of interact with the atheist community, this occurs at the point where they're drifting away from or losing their Christian community. And so now if you're a sports fan, you're attracted to other sports fans. If you're a geek, you're attracted to other geeks and those kinds of communities. You go with the community that best suits your interests at that time. And if you're deconverting, that's the most primary thing on your mind at that time. And so the thing that you would be most attracted to would be other atheists that kind of share your own criticisms and experience. The problem with that, though, is that when you go into a room full of atheists and you sit down at a table, the only thing that you're sure you have in common with these people you don't know and that you just sat next to is that you're all atheists. And so the only thing that you can really, open up and talk about at that moment is atheism. And atheism is reactionary. So really the conversation goes around all the things you don't like about religion. Now, once you join that community and you start to become involved in that community, you go through something similar to what I described with the performance control in the church. That is, you're rewarded with the approval from that community, and you find the disapproval aversive. And so the things that the community rewards with approval are you doing and saying nasty things about religion. If you go in and you own a Christian, who happens to wander into your, chat room or whatnot, and you'll get laudits and approval from the other atheists for saying nasty things. And so as a result, these atheist forums and groups become a very toxic environment. And I'm not just saying that. I actually had somebody contact me through the Facebook page that I run for my research, and he was a deconvert that then reconverted. And his main drive for reconverting was that the atheist community was so toxic, he couldn't stand it anymore. And so, there's this drive that sends you in the direction of a community that, because of the kinds of things that gain approval in that community, tends to be a very toxic community in the way that they act.
So in apologetics terms, a community could be toxic, be it Christian, be it atheist, and a community's toxicity is not a good reason to make a decision on that particular belief or corresponding factors.
Yeah. It is a good reason to find a different community, though.
Agreed.
Yeah. And I think that there are communities which are broadly atheistic but don't focus on just owning Christians, such as humanist organizations.
Yeah, I've met the local secular humanist organization. We've had some wonderful conversations. We
Mhm.
both go to a lot of the same events. So
Mhm.
we've had some wonderful conversations about a lot of different things. And it's great to be able to have those conversations, even though we differ on, our worldview significantly. We can
Mhm.
still have really good conversations as human beings.
Yeah. And so, I am not in this manner, I'm a Christian apologist. I can't endorse humanist societies that are broadly atheistic in nature,
Right.
but I will say that they tend to be less toxic than other atheist environments. And, for mental health's sake, if nothing else, I would encourage an atheist to seek out a better environment that's not as damaging in nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, uh, but yeah, that covers deconversion crisis more or less. Now, you had mentioned something about suicidal and things like that. There is a phenomenon that you hear talked about when deconverts get together, and it's called religious trauma syndrome. And there are books about religious trauma syndrome. There are counseling services related specifically to religious trauma syndrome. And religious trauma syndrome focuses around these ideas of religious abuse, which is sort of broadly defined. So exactly what that is, it might be the kind of condemnation atmosphere. It might be the kind of things that you saw the father do in this movie. Um, but of course, there's this concept that religions are conducive to sexual abuse. So that assumption is kind of always built into there when they're talking about religious trauma syndrome. In fact, after I posted my research on the deconversion, I was contacted, within 2 days, I suppose, by somebody who said that I had neglected to say that a lot of people deconverted because of sexual abuse in the church. And I had neglected to involve that because I hadn't found those things in my research. And I hadn't found them probably because they get covered up. I'm not saying they don't happen. I'm sure they do. And that's tragic. Um, but I would say that the reason for that is that whenever you open a position where a person has a level of power or influence over a certain group of people, you attract individuals who will misuse that power. And, a church environment, unfortunately, is a good place for somebody to groom people, a sexual predator to go through a process called grooming, where they subtly influence the behavior of a person. They develop a relationship with a person, and they all towards the goal of abusing them in such a way as, this person isn't going to report them. And possibly they could continue to abuse them after forming this relationship. So that's unfortunate. And unfortunately, church environments can tend to be conducive to individuals who are, display this grooming behavior.
And
So,
that's why you see those same kind of things in daycares a lot of the time, or the
Mhm.
school system.
Yeah.
These are the same kind of environments where adults are given positions of power, such that, like you said, the grooming process can take place.
Mhm. Yeah, when I graduated college and originally started working in a group home for children that had been pulled by social services, I was at that time a young single guy, and I was looked at with suspicion, being a young single guy who decided to go into a position of childcare. So it's not unknown. Now, so this is the darkest side of religious trauma syndrome. Another reason for religious trauma syndrome is that um, after you deconvert, you suddenly have a different view over your life. You are now an atheist. Everything that you believed about your life before you've discarded. And so as you look back over your life story, you have to redefine everything that happened to you. Um, and so you create a different narrative of your life. You look back at spiritual experiences that you had, um, and as the pastor was speaking, you agreed with him. You may have gone through these heavily emotional experiences and so forth. And now you have to reinterpret what those experiences as actually were from your new perspective. They weren't what you thought they were back when you were religious. They had to be something different. And so you have this idea in your life that you were deceived, you were taken advantage of, and all of these things that you thought were true were a lie. And so, after this deconversion and narrative occurs, your life up to that point is, made unhappy because of the new narrative that you have. And so this can be part of that traumatic situation, is that now you've wasted an X amount of your life, and, you have a very different outlook on what that part of your life was like. And that can be traumatic as well.
I can understand why. I mean, if you view many very significant experiences in your life as a lie, regardless of whether they were something artificial or, or whether they were something, very sincerely intended by other people. If you view all those as lies or deception,
Yeah.
It's not going to help with that whole community thing either, because it's really going to rip it down.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to cause a lot of distrust and a lot of pain.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when you talk to deconverts, they don't see the church people and religious people and so forth as being mistaken. They see them as being deceptive.
Yeah.
These people are liars that take advantage of people. They're not people who sincerely believe what they think is true and are just mistaken about it. No, they take advantage of people. They're manipulators. They're liars. And this is their new perspective, because they, at one point, they fell for it.
Yeah, I can see why they come to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, any final thoughts on the movie? This fine piece of entertainment?
Well, I mean, there's so much wrong with that statement in itself. Like you said, the premise was okay. Could have been something really good, but
could have been a fun movie.
Instead, it just wasn't. And I'm glad we were able to pull as much discussion as we were from it. I think that's valuable. I think it's certainly, if I were discussing this with somebody and they brought this up as their favorite movie, I'm going to start with questions like, why is that? I'm going to try and be respectful, ask them why that is. And then I'm going to lead into maybe a discussion about, okay, what about this whole deconversion you see here? I have a friend who does research on deconversion and thinks it's pretty accurate. So what do you think of that? Just from a practical apologetic standpoint, those are the kind of conversations I'm going to start to have over this movie if it comes up. Other than that, I think we should take away some empathy, because whether or not the straw man that's presented here is true, and I don't believe it is by any means, and I think that's very logically ascertainable. I think we have to realize that this is how some people see the situation. This is how it was written in this movie. This is how it was portrayed for a reason. Is some people are looking at it and this is what they're seeing. They're seeing somebody that is set free from something that is very shallow, very dismissive of evolution, and very focused on the freedom that comes with being released from religious rules. There's something honest about that in terms of at least the perspective people are coming at this with. So for that reason, I think there's some value here in terms of what we can see in that. I hope we've fleshed it out enough here in this conversation that viewers wouldn't feel the need to have to go and check out this movie to get that, because I think we've covered it. I certainly don't believe there's anything demonic or evil about watching this kind of movie. But it has to be done with discerning eyes. So
yeah, it's got comedic moments, but it fell short.
Yeah.
It could have been more Harry and the Hendersons than Ted, but they decided to go that direction.
Right. But, there's a certain value that I think can be put on most pieces of art. And, me and my daughter had the same conversation. Right. Well, we could go down that whole road too. But I'm one of those who even finds value in shock art, if you will. I think there's value to be had there as well. But any kind of movie, there's some worldview people are coming at it from, and there's going to be assertions put in the writing of the movie, in the characters in the movie, that you have to be able to look for. And I was having this conversation with my daughter the other night about Frozen 2.
Hold up. She saw Ted? Or I'm sorry, she saw Paul?
No, this was about Frozen 2. Not this movie, but the example holds up. I did not let her watch this with me. The example holds
Wise
up.
decision.
Yeah, I agree. There are certain assumptions snuck into things. There's a lot of Wiccan ideas snuck into Frozen 2, if you will. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying run from it, stay away from it. But we were able to have a discussion over this. Well, what do you think about the worldview that's presented here? What do you think they're saying about religion and spirits and this kind of thing? We had a great conversation about it. And she recognized that, okay, this movie's presenting different ideas than what the Bible teaches us. It was a great conversation. Movies can be good for that. So, us sitting down, being able to take a look at this rough R-rated comedy, that really tries to be creative with its bad language. Like, there is value to be had in that. If other people can learn from this kind of conversation and take that back to the movies they're watching and experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's my final word.
All right. Well, I suppose this is the time that we tell our watchers to, give us a thumbs up, hit that notification bell, and, the best place to follow us currently is Facebook. I try to keep our Twitter feed up to date, but we tend to be a little bit more on the ball with Facebook than we do Twitter, and that's just because all the Mentionables are, involved in the Facebook community. That's kind of how we roll.
Yep.
Because we're old.
Yeah, we've got to use these old formats,
Yep. We
but
just joined that new thing, but I don't remember what it's called.
We're working on getting on Parler, but we're not quite there yet. So, anywho, as Joel said, check out our Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube. You'll get notified of all this kind of stuff when it happens. And that's it. Y'all have a good night.